Right now, somewhere in your body, there's a protein that 85% of humanity carries on the surface of their red blood cells. It's called the red factor, and if you have it, you're Re positive. Simple, normal, unremarkable. But here's where things get weird. If you're part of the other 15%, if you're rate negative, you don't have this protein at all. And nobody, not geneticists, not evolutionary biologists, not hematologists, nobody can fully explain why. See, in biology, when something disappears from a population, there's usually a reason. A mutation that stops producing a protein typically means that protein wasn't essential for survival or maybe lacking it, provided some advantage. That's how evolution works. But the Rh factor, it's ancient. It's in rhesus monkeys, which is where it got its name. It's in apes. It's in nearly every primate species on Earth, which means our ancestors had it for millions of years before some humans mysteriously lost it. And here's the part that keeps researchers up at night. When an Rh bios researchers up at night, when an Rh positive baby, her body treats the fetus like a foreign invader, her immune system literally attacks her own child. Without modern medical intervention, the baby often dies. The mother's body becomes hostile to her own offspring. Now, think about that from an evolutionary perspective. A trait that makes mothers reject their babies should have been eliminated from the gene pool millions of years ago. But it wasn't. Instead, 15% of us carry it. In some populations, like the Basque people of Spain and France, that number jumps to 35%. Something doesn't add up. You know that feeling when you stumble into information that feels like it shouldn't be public, like you've opened a door you weren't supposed to find. That's what diving into Rh-negative research feels like, because the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. This isn't just about blood types. It's about ancient texts describing beings with special blood. It's about royal families obsessively tracking their lineages. It's about modern abduction researchers noticing that an unusually high percentage of people claiming contact with non-human intelligence are Re-negative. If you're settling in with this to fall asleep, or just curious about where this is going, do me a favor and drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I check these and it's fascinating. Tokyo at sunrise, New York at midnight, London during lunch, all of us scattered across the planet. Maybe some of us carrying this mysterious blood, trying to figure out what it means. The official scientific explanation is straightforward. Re-negative blood is just a genetic mutation, probably emerged around 35,000 years ago, spread through certain populations. Nothing mysterious about it. But that explanation has holes you could drive a truck through. For one thing, if it's just a random mutation, why does it cluster so heavily in specific populations? Why are the Basque people, who speak a language unrelated to any other on Earth and have genetic markers suggesting they're one of Europe's oldest indigenous groups, so overwhelmingly Rh-negative? Why do European royal families who've been obsessively inbreeding for centuries to keep their bloodlines pure have such high rates of rage of negative blood? And why, if you start digging through ancient texts, do you keep finding references to special bloodlines? The Nephilim in the Book of Enoch, described as offspring of angels and humans, the blue-blooded aristocracy, a term that supposedly comes from Spanish nobles whose pale skin showed their veins so clearly they appear to have blue blood. The divine right of kings, which wasn't just political propaganda, but was tied to the belief that royal blood was literally different from commoner blood. Here's what we're going to explore together. We'll start with the hard science. What actually makes Rh-negative blood different at a cellular level? Because understanding the biology is crucial to understanding why this matters. Then we'll dive into the Basque mystery, a people who shouldn't exist according to conventional migration patterns, whose language predates Indo-European expansion, and whose blood tells a story that doesn't fit the standard narrative of human evolution. From there, we'll explore the ancient astronaut theories, the Nephilim connections, the persistent legends of beings from elsewhere breeding with humans and leaving behind a genetic legacy. We'll look at why European royalty became obsessed with bloodline purity and what they might have known that we've forgotten. We'll examine the alleged traits associated with Rh-negative blood. The higher IQs, the lower body temperatures, the unusual healing abilities, the claims of psychic sensitivity. Some of this is documented, some of it is anecdotal, all of it is strange. We'll investigate the alien hypothesis, the theory that Rh-negative blood isn't a mutation at all, but an introduction, something added to the human genome by outside intervention. And we'll dive into the conspiracy theories, the claims that secret societies have been tracking Rh-negative bloodlines for centuries, that governments know more than they're saying, that there's a reason this information stays on the fringes of mainstream science. The question isn't whether Rh-negative blood is different. It obviously is. The question is what that difference means, where it came from, and why. After decades of genetic research, we still don't have satisfying answers. Something about this blood doesn't fit, and maybe, just maybe, that's because it doesn't belong here at all. Let's talk about blood. Not the Hollywood version, not the stuff of vampire legends, but the actual biological substance pumping through your veins right now. Because in 1937, two researchers working with rhesus monkeys stumbled onto something that would fundamentally change our understanding of human biology, and in the process they uncovered a mystery that science still hasn't fully explained. Carl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener were studying blood incompatibility. Nothing glamorous, just rigorous laboratory work trying to understand why some blood transfusions worked while others killed the patient. They were injecting rhesus monkey blood into rabbits, studying the immune responses, doing the kind of meticulous experimental work that rarely makes headlines. Then they tested human blood against the antibodies they'd created. What they found shouldn't have been possible. Most people, about 85% of the human population, had blood that reacted to the rhesus antibodies. Their blood cells carried something, a protein marker that matched what was found in the monkeys. They called it the rhesus factor, or Rh-positive. Simple enough, but the other 15%, their blood showed nothing. No reaction, no protein marker. It was as if they were missing something that should be there, something that every known primate species had. They called this absence Rh-negative. Now, before we dive into the deep end, let's get the basic biology straight, because this matters. The difference between Rh-positive and difference between Rh-positive and Rh-negative blood isn't some mystical force or genetic anomaly from another dimension. It's a protein. Specifically, it's called the D antigen, one of about 50 proteins that can exist on the surface of red blood cells. Rh-positive individuals have this protein. Rh-negative individuals don't. That's it. That's the entire biological difference. Except it's not that simple. Because that one missing P. Because that one missing P protein creates consequences that nature really shouldn't allow. Here's where it gets disturbing. When an Rh-negative woman gets pregnant with an I-positive baby, her body treats the fetus like an invading organism. During pregnancy, especially during birth, some of the baby's blood cells can cross into the mother's bloodstream. Her immune system, encountering this foreign protein it has never seen before, does what immune systems do. It attacks. It creates antibodies specifically designed to destroy anything carrying that Rh-positive marker. The first pregnancy usually ends fine. The baby is born before the mother's immune system can mount a full response, but those antibodies stay in her system waiting. If she gets pregnant again with another Rh-positive baby, her body's ready this time. The antibodies cross the placenta and start destroying the baby's red blood cells while it's still in the womb. This condition is called hemolytic disease of the newborn. This condition is called hemolytic disease of the newborn. And before modern medicine figured out how to prevent it with Rh immune globulin injections, it killed or severely damaged countless infants. Let that sink in for a moment. A mother's body designed by evolution to nurture and protect offspring. Instead, attacks and potentially kills her own baby. This is the opposite of what natural selection should produce. Every other biological system is optimized for reproductive success. That's the whole point of evolution. Pass on your genes, protect your offspring, ensure the next generation survives. But Rh-negative blood actively works against reproduction when paired with Rh-positive partners. From a pure evolutionary standpoint, Rh-negative blood should have been eliminated from the human gene pool thousands of years ago. Any trait that reduces reproductive success gets weeded out fast. That's how natural selection works. But not only has Rh-negative blood survived, it thrived in certain populations, reaching concentrations as high as 35% in some regions. So either evolution made a mistake, which it rarely does, or something else is going on. Let's look at the comparative biology, because this is where things get really strange. Landsteiner and Wiener discovered the Rh factor By studying Reese's monkeys, those monkeys were RIB positive, just like 85% of humans. Then researchers started testing other primates. Chimpanzees Rh positive, gorillas Rh positive, orangutans, gibbons, baboons, every primate species they could get blood samples from, all Rh positive. Every single one except humans were the only primate species that shows this variation. The only ones with a significant population lacking something that appears to be universal among our closest evolutionary relatives. Now, you might be thinking this is just a mutation, a genetic variant that appeared randomly and stuck around through genetic drift. And maybe you're right, genetic mutations happen all the time. Most of them are neutral, neither helpful nor harmful, and they persist in populations just by chance. But here's the problem with that explanation. Rh-negative blood isn't neutral. It's actively disadvantageous for reproduction, and it's not randomly distributed. This is where the geographical distribution becomes impossible to ignore. The highest concentration of Rh-negative blood on Earth is found among the Basque people of northern Spain and southern France. About 35% of ethnic bases are Rh-negative, more than double the European average. From that center point in the Basque region, Rh-negative frequencies gradually decrease as you move outward. Western Europeans show rates around 15 to 16%. Eastern Europeans drop to 10 to 12%. Move into Asia and the frequency plummets to 1% or less. In Sub-Sahara and Africa and among indigenous populations of the Americas and Australia, Rh-negative blood is virtually non-existent, often less than 1%. This isn't a random pattern. This is a distribution map that suggests a point of origin, a place where Rh-negative blood first appeared and then spread outward through migration and mixing. The Basque region isn't just randomly high in Rh-negative frequency, it's the epicenter, and as you move away from that epicenter through successive waves of migration and population mixing, the frequency dilutes population. Geneticists have run the numbers on this. For Rh-negative blood to reach 35% frequency in a population, given its reproductive disadvantage, one of three things has to be true. Either it appeared very recently, so natural selection hasn't had time to eliminate it yet, or it provides some hidden survival advantage that we haven't identified, something that outweighs the reproductive costs. Or it was deliberately maintained through cultural practices, selective breeding, or population isolation. The recent appearance theory doesn't work. Genetic dating puts the Rh-negative mutation somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 years ago. That's plenty of time for natural selection to reduce it to trace levels if it was truly disadvantageous. The hidden advantage theory is possible, but decades of research haven't identified any clear benefit. Rh-negative individuals don't show better disease resistance, longer lifespans, or any other obvious survival edge, which leaves us with the third option. And this is where mainstream science starts getting uncomfortable, because if Rh-negative blood reached high frequencies through non-random processes, through selective breeding or cultural preservation, then somebody was doing the selecting. Somebody decided this blood type was worth preserving, worth maintaining even at the cost of reproductive complications. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the historical and cultural mysteries, we need to look at one more piece of biological evidence that makes the whole picture even stranger. Remember how every other primate species is Rh positive? Well, researchers have traced the genetic history of the RI factor back through evolutionary time. The protein complex that creates the RIB positive marker appears to have originated in primitive mammals more than 160 million years ago. It's been conserved, meaning it's remained essentially unchanged through the entire evolution of primates. From tiny lemurs to great apes, every branch of the primate family tree has maintained this protein. Conservation across that much evolutionary time suggests the protein is important, maybe even critical for something. Evolution doesn't preserve useless traits for 160 million years. The fact that it's universal among primates suggests it provides some fundamental advantage. Yet humans lost it, or more accurately, some humans lost it, and not only survived but thrived. This is the biological paradox at the heart of the rite of the mystery. A trait that appears beneficial and universal among all primates suddenly becomes optional in one species. A trait that creates reproductive complications somehow reaches high frequency in isolated populations. A trait that should have been eliminated by natural selection instead becomes one of the defining characteristics of specific ethnic groups. Modern medicine has largely solved the practical problems of Rye incompatibility. Rye-negative mothers get immunoglobulin injections that prevent their bodies from producing antibodies against their Rye-positive babies. The crisis that once killed thousands of infants every year has been reduced to a manageable medical condition, but solving the practical problem hasn't solved the theoretical mystery. Why does Ras-negative blood exist at all? Where did it come? Rome. And why, despite all the evolutionary pressures working against it, has it persisted and even flourished in certain human populations? The standard scientific answer is mutation and genetic drift, a random change in the DNA that eliminated the Rye factor protein, followed by population bottlenecks and founder effects that allowed the trait to reach high frequencies in isolated groups. It's a neat, tidy explanation that fits within conventional evolutionary theory, and it might even be true, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the Basque people, who also have unique linguistic and genetic characteristics, setting them apart from surrounding populations, show such extraordinarily high Rh-negative frequencies. It doesn't explain the cultural traditions that seem to have developed around blood purity in certain royal lineages. It doesn't explain the persistent historical references to special bloodlines, chosen people, or the offspring of gods. We're left with a biological fact that opens onto a series of historical, cultural, and anthropological mysteries. It's measurable, it's different, and its distribution across human populations tells a story that we're only beginning to understand. A story that starts with genetics, but leads into ancient history, isolated populations, and questions about human origins that mainstream science isn't quite ready to ask. There's a place in Europe where the rules don't apply, a region tucked between France and Spain where the people speak a language that shouldn't exist, carry genes that don't match anyone around them, and possess the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood on planet Earth. Up to 35% of the Basque population carries this genetic marker. For context, that's more than double the rate found anywhere else in Europe and nearly 7 times the global average. This isn't just a statistical anomaly. This is a genetic signature so distinct, so concentrated, that it demands an explanation. The Basque call themselves Euskalunak, speakers of Euskara. And that language, it's unlike anything else on Earth. Linguists have been trying to connect Euskara to other language families for over 200 years. They failed. Every time someone claims they found a connection to Caucasian languages or ancient Iberian or even Proto-Indo-European, other researchers tear the hypothesis apart. The evidence just isn't there. Euskara stands alone, a linguistic island surrounded by a sea of Indo-European languages that swept across Europe thousands of years ago, erasing almost everything that came before. Except here in these mountains, the old language survived. But it's not just the language. The genetic evidence is even more bewildering. When scientists started analyzing Basque DNA in the 1990s, they expected to find typical Western European markers. Instead, they found a population that was genetically distinct from everyone around them. The Basques don't cluster with Spaniards. They don't cluster with French. They don't even cluster with other Iberian populations who live just a few hundred miles away. Their genetic signature suggests they've been isolated for an extraordinary length of time. We're talking thousands of years of genetic continuity. While empires rose and fell around them, while waves of migration swept through Europe, while everyone else was mixing and blending, the Basques remained apart, distinct, different. Now, isolation alone wouldn't necessarily preserve Rye-negative blood at such high frequencies. Genetic drift could have increased it randomly in a small population. But here's the thing, the Basques weren't that small, and they weren't completely isolated. They traded with surrounding populations, sometimes fought with them, occasionally married into them. Yet somehow that 35% Rh-negative frequency remained stable for millennia. This suggests active selection, either cultural practices that favored Rh-negative bloodlines or some unknown environmental or biological factor that gave Rh-negative individuals an advantage in this specific region. The marriage customs provide a clue. For as far back as records go, Basque communities practiced what anthropologists call endogamy, strict preference for marrying within the group. not just within the Basque people as a whole, but within specific valleys, specific villages. A person from one valley might travel 30 m to the next valley and be considered a foreigner, an outsider. Marriage alliances were carefully negotiated between families who had known each other for generations. This wasn't unusual in pre-Adorn societies, but the Basques took it to an extreme. They maintained these practices long after other European populations had become more mobile and cosmopolitan. Even into the 20th century, many Basque communities showed strong preferences for local marriages. This created what geneticists call a founder effect on steroids. If the original Basque population had a high frequency of Rouhan-negative blood and they maintained strict endogamy for thousands of years, that frequency would be preserved and even amplified. But this raises another question. Where did that original high frequency come from? Who were the founders? The theories range from scientific to speculative to completely wild. The mainstream archaeological view is that the Basques are descendants of the original hunter-gatherer populations who lived in Western Europe before the arrival of farming peoples around 7,000 years ago. When Indo-European speakers swept across Europe during the Bronze Age, they mixed with and largely replaced these older populations, except in the Basque country. The mountains provided refuge. The locals resisted cultural and genetic assimilation. They preserved their ancient language and their ancient genes while the rest of Europe was being transformed. This explanation fits the linguistic evidence. Euskara could be a survivor from that pre-Indo-European linguistic landscape, the last echo of languages that once covered the continent. It fits the genetic evidence too. Studies show the bases have higher frequencies of genetic markers associated with Western European hunter-gatherers than any other modern population. But it doesn't fully explain the Rho-negative mystery. If the Bars are simply preserved hunter-gatherers, why don't other isolated European populations show similar Rh-negative frequencies? The Sardinians were isolated. The Icelanders were isolated. Neither shows anything close to Basque levels. This is where things get interesting. Some researchers have suggested the bases might be survivors of a much older European population, one that predates even the hunter-gatherers we know from the archaeological record. There are tantalizing hints of human presence in Europe going back hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals were here, Denisovans might have been here, and there were likely other human populations we haven't identified yet, groups that left minimal archaeological traces but might have contributed genes to later populations. What if the Bars carry genetic heritage from one of these mystery populations? What if that's where the Rh-negative concentration comes from? A bloodline so ancient it predates the normal categories we use to understand human ancestry. This would explain why the Basque genetic signature is so distinct, why their language connects to nothing else, why they seem to be something older than the populations around them. Then there are the caves. The Basque region is home to some of Europe's most spectacular Paleolithic cave art. Alamera, just outside the traditional Basque territory, contains paintings that 36,000 years old. Caves deeper in Basque country show evidence of continuous human occupation going back even further. And the art itself is extraordinary. Not just simple hunting scenes, but complex compositions showing animals, human figures, and geometric patterns that some researchers think might represent astronomical observations. Cave paintings in Lascaux and other sites show arrangements of dots and marks that correlate with lunar cycles and stellar positions. The people who created this art were tracking the heavens, recording their observations over generations. Were they the ancestors of the Bas? Did they pass down astronomical knowledge along with their language and their blood? The Basque calendar and traditional cosmology show unusual sophistication with detailed systems for tracking solar and lunar cycles that seem to predate known Mediterranean influences. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting the cave paintings represent a kind of prototyping system, a way of encoding complex information that predates Sumerian ununiform by 30,000 years. If true, this would make the Bas the inheritors of Europe's oldest literary tradition, but the evidence remains controversial. The symbols could be astronomical records, or ritual markings, or something we don't yet understand. And then there are the really wild theories. Atlantis inevitably comes up. The Basque region is near the Atlantic coast. Their maritime traditions go back millennia. Some speculative researchers have suggested the Basques are survivors of a lost Atlantic civilization, possibly Plato's Atlantis itself. According to this theory, when their homeland sank or was destroyed, survivors fled to the mountains of northern Spain and southern France, bringing their language, their genetic legacy, and possibly advanced knowledge that was gradually lost over generations. There's no archaeological evidence for this. None. But the theory persists because it offers a neat explanation for all the mysteries at once. The unique language brought from Atlantis, the distinct genetics, an isolated Atlantic population, the ISDH blood, a marker of the Atlantean bloodline. It's compelling storytelling even if it's not compelling science. What we can say with certainty is this: the Basques are extraordinary. They represent a genetic and cultural continuity that spans thousands of years, preserved through a combination of geography, culture, and possibly selection pressures we don't fully understand. They carry the highest concentration of Rh, negative blood, anywhere on Earth. They speak a language that connects to nothing else in the human family, and they've maintained their distinct identity through Roman conquest, Visigothic invasion, Moorish expansion, and Spanish centralization. They are survivors of something old, something that predates the Europe we think we know. Whether they're simply the last descendants of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, or whether they represent something stranger, something older, something that challenges our understanding of human history, the Basque mystery endures. And at the center of that mystery is blood, the blood that 35% of them carry, the blood that sets them apart, the blood that might hold secrets we're only beginning to understand. Let's talk about the oldest conspiracy theory in human history, not the kind you find on internet forums, the kind that's written in texts thousands of years old, repeated across dozens of cultures, that supposedly never contacted each other and consistently describes the same impossible event: giants walking the earth, gods breeding with humans, and bloodlines that weren't quite human anymore. Genesis 6:1. 4. Most people ski. IP right past this section on their way to the flood story. But these 4 verses contain one of the most disturbing passages in the entire Bible. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 4 verses, that's it. The Bible drops this absolutely explosive claim. Beings called sons of God, breeding with human women and producing hybrid offspring called Nephilim, and then just moves on. No explanation, no details, just a casual mention that non-human entities were creating hybrid bloodlines and producing heroes of old, men of renown. Then the flood comes and supposedly washes it all away. Except the text says the Nephilim were there and also afterward after the flood, which means either some of them survived or the breeding program started up again. And if you're wondering whether you're reading that correctly, whether the text really is describing what it seems to be describing, ancient Jewish and Christian scholars wondered the same thing, and most of them concluded, yes, this is exactly what it's describing. Interbreeding between human and non-human entities, creating hybrid bloodlines that persisted through human populations. Now the mainstream interpretation tries to soften this. Some scholars argue the sons of God were just the descendants of Seth, the righteous line, breeding with the descendants of Cain, the corrupted line. But this interpretation has problems. Why would the text use such bizarre language to describe human intermarriage? Why would regular humans produce giants? And why would this particular event trigger the fly? Owed the complete destruction of the world if it was just people marrying other people. The early church fathers didn't buy the sanitized version. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, they all understood the text literally. Non-human entities, whether you call them angels, gods, or something else, came to earth and bred with humans. The offspring were the Nephilim, giants who became the mighty men and men of renown mentioned in ancient texts, and their bloodlines persisted. But Genesis gives us almost nothing to work with. Just 4 verses in the aftermath. If you want the full story, you have to go to a text that didn't make it into the Bible. The Book of Enoch. Enoch is fascinating because it was considered scripture by early Christians. It's quoted in the New Testament book of Jude. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still includes it in their Bible, but for most Christian denominations, it was removed. declared apocryphal, too strange to be canonical. And when you read what it says, you start understanding why church authorities might have wanted it buried. The Book of Enoch names names. It identifies 200 angels called Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, took an oath together, and decided to take human wives. Their leader was Sinjaza, but the most infamous was Azel. These weren't just random encounters. This was organized, planned, 200 non-human entities making a collective decision to interbreed with humanity. And Enoch describes what they taught humans in exchange. Azel taught men to make weapons and women to use cosmetics. Samjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Other watchers taught astrology, the signs of the earth, the signs of the sun and moon. They gave humans knowledge that, according to the text, humans weren't supposed to have yet, technology and information that accelerated human civilization, but also corrupted it. The offspring of these unions were giants. Enoch describes them as 3,000 cubits tall, which is obviously exaggerated, but the point is clear. These weren't normal humans. They were massive, powerful, and hungry. The text says they consumed all the resources humans could produce, then started eating humans themselves, then turned on each other, drinking each other's blood. The world descended into violence and corruption, so severe that God decided to wipe it all away. But here's what matters for our purposes. Enoch describes these beings as having distinct physical characteristics, unusual size, unusual strength, and by implication, unusual genetics. They were hybrids, carrying genes from whatever the Watchers were, and genes from human mothers. And those genes didn't just disappear. They mixed into human populations. They created bloodlines that were different, marked by their non-human ancestry. Now, put yourself in the position of someone who takes these texts seriously, not as myth or metaphor, but as historical accounts, even if imperfectly understood by ancient writers. You're looking at genetic evidence of human populations that show unusual characteristics, lower disease rates, different blood types, cognitive differences, psychological traits that cluster in specific populations. And you're reading ancient texts that describe hybrid bloodlines created through interbreeding with non-human entities. The question becomes impossible to ignore. Could Rh-negative blood be the genetic signature of these ancient hybridization events? The theory goes like this. The Watchers, or Nephilim, or whatever you want to call them, weren't entirely human. Their genetics were different in fundamental ways. When they bred with human women, most of the offspring died. The genetic incompatibility was too great, but some survived, carrying a mixed genetic heritage that included whatever genes the non-human parent contributed. One of these genetic markers was Rh-negative blood, a blood type that doesn't follow normal evolutionary patterns, that causes rejection between mother and child, as if they're different species that appears suddenly in human populations without clear ancestral precedent. And here's where it gets weird. This isn't just a biblical story. The same narrative appears everywhere. The Sumerians, writing 2,000 years before Genesis, described the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens and created hybrid humans to serve them. These hybrids were described as having special characteristics, greater intelligence, longer lifespans, and bloodlines that set them apart from ordinary humans. The Sumerian king lists include rulers who supposedly reigned for thousands of years, which scholars dismiss as mythology. But what if it's a garbled memory of something real? Beings or bloodlines that age differently, that carried genetics that extended lifespan or altered development. The Greeks told the same story. Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, the entire Greek pantheon was constantly breeding with human women, producing heroes like Hercules, Perseus, Achilles. These demigods had superhuman strength, unusual resilience, and bloodlines that granted them special status. They were literally called heroes, the exact same term used in Genesis to describe the Nephilim, men of renown. Individuals marked by their divine ancestry. Hindu texts describe the devs, celestial beings who interacted with, and sometimes bred with humans, producing Lygias with special spiritual gifts and physical characteristics. Norse mythology has the breeding with humans. Celtic legends describe the Tuatha De Danann, godlike beings who came to Ireland and whose bloodlines mixed with human populations. Japanese mythology has similar stories of celestial beings descending and creating hybrid bloodlines. You see the pattern. Dozens of cultures spread across the globe, supposedly isolated from each other, all telling the same basic story. Beings from somewhere else, whether you call it heaven, the sky, another realm, or another planet, came to Earth and bred with humans. The offspring were different, special, marked by their hybrid nature. And their bloodlines persisted, creating dynasties and populations with unusual characteristics. Mainstream scholarship dismisses this as archetypal mythology, universal human stories about the divine mixing with the mortal. But that explanation has problems. Why would independent cultures develop such specific similar stories? Why do these texts consistently emphasize bloodlines, genetic descent, and the persistence of these hybrid characteristics through generations? Ancient peoples understood heredity. They knew children inherited traits from parents. When their texts emphasized bloodlines carrying divine or non-human ancestry, they're making claims about genetics, even if they didn't have that word for it. And many of these texts explicitly describe blood as the carrier of this inheritance. In Genesis, God tells Noah the blood is the life and commands specific rules about blood that suggest it carries something more than just physical nutrients. Ancient cultures were obsessed with bloodlines, with maintaining pure descent from divine ancestors. Egyptian pharaohs practiced brother marriage specifically to preserve their divine blood. European royalty did the same for centuries. Why? What were they trying to preserve? The skeptical interpretation is obvious. These are just myths, ancient people trying to explain their own existence, their own social hierarchies, their own feelings of being special or different. They created stories about divine ancestry to justify their power and status. The persistence of these stories across cult eras just reflects universal human psychology, not historical events. But then you run into the problem of the physical evidence. Ancient skeletal remains showing unusual characteristics, elongated skulls in Peru, Egypt, and Malta. Giant skeletons allegedly found and then disappeared into museum storage. DNA analysis of ancient populations showing genetic anomalies that don't fit standard models, and blood types, specifically Rh-negative blood, that appear suddenly in human populations without clear evolutionary ancestry. Could Rh-negative blood be the remnant of something that really happened? A hybridization event so ancient it survived only as mythology, a breeding program that created bloodlines carrying non-human genetics, the genetic signature of the Nephilim? Or is this just pattern recognition gone haywire? Human brains seeing connections that aren't there, weaving ancient myths and modern genetics into a narrative that feels compelling but has no basis in reality. The texts can't answer this for us. They can only tell us that something happened, or that ancient people believed something happened, that created bloodlines they considered fundamentally different from ordinary humanity. Whether that something was literal interbreeding with non-human entities, genetic manipulation by an advanced civilization, or just cultural mythology playing out over thousands of years, we can't know from the text alone. But we can look at who guarded these bloodlines most carefully, who obsessed over maintaining pure descent, who killed to protect their genetic inheritance. We can look at the royalty, the aristocracy, the self-proclaimed elite who claimed their right to rule came from their blood, from their descent from gods and heroes. Because if the Nephilim connection is real, if Rh-negative blood really does mark hybrid ancestry, then the people who carry it would have known, they would have understood, they were different, and they would have done everything in their power to maintain that difference, to preserve their special bloodlines, and to keep the rest of humanity from understanding what made them special. Which brings us to the next question. What were the royal families of Europe really protecting? And why were they so obsessed with blood? Picture a cold morning in January 1793. The guillotine stands ready in Paris. King Louis XVI of France is about to lose his head, literally ending over 1,000 years of French royal bloodlines. But in that moment, as the blade falls, something else is being severed. A genetic thread that European royal families are protected with obsessive, almost fanatical determination for centuries. Because the French kings, like virtually every major European royal house, carried something in their veins they believed made them fundamentally different from everyone else. Not just wealth, not just power, something biological, something that justified why they and only they should rule. Now, we don't have Louis XVI's blood type on record. DNA analysis wasn't exactly available in 1793, but we do have extensive records for his cousins, descendants, and the vast interconnected web of European royalty. And when modern researchers finally got access to those bloodlines, either through living descendants or preserved tissue samples, they found something remarkable. Rye-negative blood shows up in European royal families at rates that are statistically impossible to explain by random chance. The British royal family, multiple confirmed Rh negatives. The Spanish Bourbons, Rh negative. The Dutch House of Orange, Raj negative. The Habsburgs, who ruled most of Europe for half a millennium. Raj negative running through generation after generation. We're not talking about slightly elevated percentages here. We're talking about rates that are 3, 4, sometimes 5 times higher than the general European population. In some aristocratic lineages, Rh-negative blood shows up in more than half of all documented individuals. This isn't coincidence. This is selection. Deliberate, systematic, maintained across centuries. But selection for what? And more importantly, how did medieval royal families, hundreds of years before modern blood typing, know what they were selecting for? Let's start with the what we can document. European aristocratic families kept genealogical records that were insanely detailed, not just names and dates, but physical descriptions, personality traits, medical conditions, everything that might be relevant to bloodline management. The Habsburgs, who were probably the most obsessive about this, maintained records going back to the 11th century. Every marriage, every child, every physical characteristic that ran in families, they were doing genetic tracking before anyone knew what genetics was. And they had rules, strict, elaborate, seemingly arbitrary rules about who could marry whom. Royal families couldn't just marry anyone with a crown. The bloodlines had to be compatible. Families would spend years negotiating marriages, consulting genealogical records going back generations, looking for something. They called it purity of blood. They said it was about maintaining noble lineage, but the pattern suggests they were tracking something more specific. Consider the Habsburg jaw, that famous protruding lower jaw that made eating difficult for many late Habsburgs. It's probably the most well-known genetic disorder in history, the result of generations of inbreeding. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, had it so bad he could barely chew food. He was the product of over 200 years of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, sometimes even closer relations. Modern genetic analysis shows his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been siblings. Why would anyone do this? Why would intelligent, educated people create genetic disasters through incestuous marriages? The standard explanation is that they wanted to keep power and wealth within the family. But there's a problem with that explanation. It doesn't actually work. Inbreeding produces weak, sickly rulers who lose power and territory. The late Habsburgs were plagued by genetic disorders, early deaths, and infertility. Charles II himself was impotent and died without heirs, ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely. From a practical standpoint, inbreeding was a catastrophic strategy. Unless they were trying to preserve something specific, something they valued more than health, more than military strength, more than the actual ability to rule effectively. Something in the blood. Here's where it gets really interesting. The royal families had a phrase for themselves, blue bloods. The Spanish aristocracy called themselves sangre azul, blue blood. The explanation you'll find in most history books is that this referred to the visibility of veins through their pale skin. Skin that was pale because they didn't work outdoors like peasants. But that explanation never made much sense. Plenty of poor people in Northern Europe had pale skin. The aristocracy wasn't genetically paler than Northern European commoners, but Rh-negative individuals do show some distinct physical traits. Paler skin that bruises easily, more visible veins, sometimes with a slightly bluish tint, lower body temperature. Some researchers have suggested that the blue blood reference wasn't about social class at all. It was about literal observable physical differences associated with Rye-negative blood. The kind of differences you could see without modern medical technology. The kind of differences that would let medieval aristocrats identify their own kind by sight. Now here's where the documentation gets really specific. Queen Victoria, one of the most powerful monarchs in history, whose descendants ended up on half the thrones of Europe. Victoria was Rh-negative. We know this with certainty, because she carried the gene for hemophilia, the famous bleeding disease that plagued European royalty for generations. Hemophilia is carried on the X chromosome, and it's closely associated with Rh-negative mothers. Victoria passed the disease to several of her children, who then spread it through marriage to the royal houses of Russia, Spain, and Germany. The Russian royal family, the Romanovs, got hemophilia through Victoria's granddaughter, Alexandra, who married Tsar Nicholas II. Their son, Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne, suffered from the disease so severely that minor injuries could have killed him. The desperate search for treatment led Alexandra to Rasputin, the mysterious mystic whose influence over the royal family helped destabilize Russia and contributed to the revolution that ended the Roman dynasty. One genetic disease inherited through rare genetic bloodlines helped topple an empire. But here's what's weird. The royal families knew not about hemophilia, specifically. That disease wasn't identified until the 19th century, but they knew that certain bloodlines carried risks. They knew that some marriages produced healthy children and others produced weak or sickly ones. They maintained detailed medical records going back centuries, tracking which family combinations worked and which didn't. They were doing genetic counseling without understanding the underlying biology. How? What were they tracking? What observable characteristics let them identify compatible bloodlines before modern medicine? The doctrine of the divine right of kings might give us a clue. This wasn't just propaganda. It was theology taken deadly seriously. European monarchs genuinely believed they were fundamentally different from commoners, that God had placed divine essence in their blood, making them literally holy. They believed this so completely that they would rather produce genetically damaged offspring through incest than dilute their blood with commoners. Even healthy, intelligent commoners weren't considered acceptable marriage partners for royalty, no matter how much wealth or military power they controlled. This wasn't about social snobbery. Social systems can change, adapt, make exceptions when it's practical. The royal blood obsession was absolute, inflexible, maintained even when it was clearly destructive. That's not social policy. That's religious conviction. They believed something was in their blood that had to be preserved at any cost, and they weren't the only ones. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs practiced sibling marriage for similar reasons. The Inca emperors did the same. Royal families across different cultures and time periods, who had no contact with each other, independently developed similar bloodline preservation strategies. The patterns are too consistent to be coincidental. Different societies, different religions, different political systems, but the same obsession with keeping royal blood pure through endogamous marriage. Modern genetic analysis of Egyptian mummies shows something fascinating. The pharaonic families had unusual genetic markers that don't match the general Egyptian population. Some researchers have found evidence suggesting they may have had higher rates of Rh-negative blood. Though the analysis is complicated by DNA degradation, the Inca nobility shows similar patterns, genetic outliers maintained through systematic inbreeding. Even though that inbreeding caused obvious health problems, the Europe and royal families took it further than anyone else, maintaining detailed written records that let us track the patterns across centuries, and those records reveal something that should be impossible. They were successfully tracking genetic traits before genetics was discovered, before Mendele's pea plants, before anyone understood dominant and recessive genes, blood types, or chromosomes. Yet they could predict with remarkable accuracy which marriages would produce children with desirable traits and which wouldn't. They had language for it too. Good blood, bad blood, strong inheritance, weak inheritance, descriptions of children who took after the mother's line versus the father's line. They understood, at some intuitive level, that traits were inherited from both parents and that some combinations work better than others. They were doing Mendelian genetics 1,000 years before Mendel. The Habsburg records are particularly detailed. They describe specific traits that ran in families. Red hair, particular eye colors, the famous jaw, obviously, but also more subtle things. Sensitivity to cold, unusual reactions to certain foods, low pulse rate. Some of these descriptions match known traits associated with Rh-negative blood. Others sound like they're tracking blood type compatibility without knowing what blood types were. When modern researchers analyze surviving Habsburg genetic material, they found exactly what you'd expect from centuries of inbreeding, reduced genetic diversity, accumulated mutations, but they also found something else. Preservation of specific genetic variants at rates much higher than random chance would predict. The Habsburgs weren't just randomly inbreeding. They were maintaining certain genetic profiles across generations. Profiles that included ripe, negative blood and associated traits. Why? What did they think they were preserving? Hat was so important about their blood that they'd sacrifice their health, their fertility, sometimes their lives to keep it pure. The historical records don't give us a direct answer, but they give us hints, references to royal blood being sacred, descriptions of monarchs as mediators between heaven and earth, elaborate coronation rituals involving anointing with holy oils, as if the act of becoming king required literal physical transformation. The language consistently suggests that royal families believe their blood contained something transcendent, something that couldn't be measured or analyzed, but was nonetheless real and essential. And maybe, just maybe, they were tracking something that modern science has only recently begun to understand. Something written in their DNA, something that made right negative blood special enough that families would destroy themselves trying to preserve it. The question isn't whether they were tracking genetic traits. The records prove they were. The question is what they knew about those traits that we're only now beginning to discover. Because if medieval kings understood something about regenerative blood that we don't, if they had knowledge preserved from earlier times, then maybe the blue blood wasn't just metaphor. Maybe it was recognition of something real, something that justified in their minds the obsessive, destructive bloodline preservation that defined European royalty for over 1,000 years. But the royal obsession with blood didn't end with hemophilia and the fall of monarchies. It got stranger, much stranger, and some of the people investigating it ended up discovering things that powerful institutions very much wanted to keep hidden. Now, here's where this story gets really strange, because if you spend any time in right-negative communities online, and yes, those exist, thriving forums with thousands of members, you'll start seeing people describe experiences that sound less like medical conditions and more like character sheets for some kind of genetic superhero origin story. Lower body temperature, heightened senses, unusual eye colors, psychic sensitivity. It reads like a list of traits from a science fiction novel. Except these aren't fictional characters. These are real people, tens of thousands of them, independently reporting remarkably similar experiences. So, what's going on here? Are I negatives actually different in ways that go beyond a missing blood protein? Or are we witnessing one of the most elaborate cases of collective confirmation bias in modern history? Let's start with the physical traits, the things that can theoretically be measured. The most commonly reported characteristic among Rhine negatives is lower than average body temperature. Not dramatically lower, not hypothermia territory, but consistently a few tenths of a degree below the standard 98.6 F. Online forums are full of Rh negatives, reporting typical temperatures around 97.4 to 97.8. 8 measurements that consistently puzzle their doctors who keep checking for thyroid problems or other metabolic issues that never materialize. Now, this is interesting because body temperature isn't just some random number. It's tightly regulated by the hypothalamus, the same part of your brain that controls hunger, thirst, and sleep cycles. For a significant number of people to report consistent variation from the norm suggests something might actually be different about their metabolic baseline. But here's the problem. There's no large-scale clinical study confirming this. No research team has ever systematically measured body temperature across thousands of RAM-positive and Rho-positive and Rh-negative individuals under controlled conditions. What we have is anecdotal reports, lots of them, remarkably consistent, but still anecdotal. Then there's the sensory stuff. Rh negatives frequently report heightened sensitivity to light, sound, and smell. They describe being overwhelmed in bright environments, noticing background noises. Others tune out completely, detecting odors so faint they're invisible to everyone around them. Some describe it as living with all the settings turned up, experiencing the world at higher volume than everyone else. This could explain another common complaint: difficulty in crowded or chaotic environments. If you're genuinely processing more sensory input than the average person, a busy shopping mall or packed concert venue wouldn't just be unpleasant. It would be physiologically overwhelming. Your nervous system would be drowning in data, struggling to filter signal from noise. But again, we're in murky scientific territory here. Sensory sensitivity varies widely in the general population. People with autism, certain anxiety disorders, or just high trait sensitivity often report similar experiences? Is there something specific about Rh-negative blood that causes heightened perception? Or are Rh-negatives simply more likely to notice and discuss these traits because they are already primed to see themselves as different? The eye color thing is easier to track but harder to interpret. There's a persistent claim that Rh-negatives have unusually high rates of green or hazel eyes, colors that are relatively rare in the general population. Some surveys of Rh-negative communities suggest rates as high as 40 or 50%, compared to roughly 2% worldwide for green eyes. But survey methodology matters here. Online communities aren't random samples. They're self-selected groups of people who already believe they're different. If you think Rh-negative blood makes you special, and you happen to have rare eye color, you're probably more likely to join an Rh-negative forum and fill out their surveys. Still, there's something worth noting. Eye color and blood type are both genetic traits. They're not located on the same chromosomes, but they are both determined by your DNA. If Rh-negatives descended from a small, isolated population, which the Basque evidence certainly suggests, then the population might have carried genes for both Rh-negative blood and unusual eye colors at higher than typical frequencies. That's just basic population genetics. Founder effects can preserve unusual trait combinations, but it doesn't make those traits supernatural. It just makes them statistically interesting. Now we get to the really wild claims. Psychic abilities, intuition, precognition, telepathy, the ability to sense things before they happen, or know things you shouldn't be able to know. If you read Rh-negative testimonials, these claims are everywhere. People describing knowing who's calling before they check their phone, sensing danger moments before accidents occur, having vivid dreams that later come true, feeling the emotions of people around them so intensely, it's like a sixth sense. This is where mainstream science completely checks out of the conversation. There's no reproducible evidence for psychic phenomena. Decades of rigorous testing have failed to demonstrate abilities like telepathy or precognition under controlled conditions. When people report these experiences, the scientific explanation is usually some combination of selective memory, confirmation bias, and the human brain's incredible pattern recognition capabilities working over time. We remember the times our intuition was right and forget the hundreds of times it was wrong. We notice the meaningful coincidences and ignore the meaningful coincidences and ignore the meaningless ones. But here's what's interesting. Rh-negatives aren't claiming to read minds or bend spoons. Most describe something much more subtle: enhanced empathy, heightened gut feelings, a sense of knowing that feels more refined than what others experience. Could there be something to this? Well, empathy and intuition aren't magic. They're information processing. Your brain constantly monitors subtle social cues, facial micro-expressions, tone of voice, body language, details your conscious mind never registers. Some people are better at this than others. They pick up on emotional states, sense tension or deception, read rooms with uncanny accuracy, not through supernatural means, but through highly refined unconscious processing of social information. If our negatives genuinely have heightened sensory sensitivity, if they're processing more environmental data than average, then it follows logically that they might also be better at picking up on these subtle social signals, not psychic, just more observant at a level below conscious awareness. The problem is proving this. How do you design an experiment that separates genuine enhanced empathy from the expectation of enhanced empathy? If someone believes they're more intuitive, they'll pay more attention to their hunches, which makes those hunches seem more accurate, which reinforces the belief. It's a feedback loop that's almost impossible to untangle without massive sample sizes and carefully controlled conditions, and nobody's funding that research. Why would they? From the mainstream scientific perspective, Rh-negative is just a blood type. End of story. But then we get to the medical stuff. The documented differences that even skeptical scientists have to acknowledge. Rh-negative individuals do respond differently to certain medications and anesthesia. This isn't speculation or anecdote, it's observed clinical reality. Anesthesiologists have noted for decades that some patients require higher doses to achieve the same level of sedation. Nobody knows exactly why, and most medical professionals don't routinely track whether these patients are Rh-negative, but the pattern was up often enough that some practitioners have started paying attention. Similarly, there's emerging evidence that Rh-negatives might have different responses to certain psychiatric medications, SSRIs, the most common class of antidepressants, seem to work differently, sometimes requiring adjusted dosing or producing unexpected side effects. Again, this isn't widely studied or well understood, but it's real, it's measurable, it's happening in clinical settings where confirmation bias can't explain away the results. Then there's disease resistance. This one has more solid scientific backing. Studies have shown that Rh-negative individuals have lower rates of certain parasitic infections. Toxoplasmosis, for example, the parasite carried by cats that infects billions of humans worldwide, appears to have slightly lower infection rates among Rh-negatives. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but it might relate to differences in red blood cell surface chemistry. Parasites that invade blood cells have to interact with surface proteins. If your cells lack certain proteins, some parasites might have a harder time gaining entry. There's also intriguing data suggesting Rh negatives might have different rates of certain autoimmune conditions. Though the picture here is complicated, some conditions appear more common, others less common. The pattern suggests Rh-negative immune systems might be calibrated differently, responding more aggressively to certain threats and less aggressively to others. But here's the thing, these differences, the real measurable ones, they're subtle. We're talking about percentage points of variation, not categorical differences. Rh-negatives get sick. They feel pain. They need anesthesia, just maybe a bit more of it. They're not superhuman. They're human with minor statistical variations in physiological responses. So what do we make of all this? On one hand, you have thousands of people independently reporting remarkably similar traits: lower body temperature, heightened senses, strong empathy, unusual responses to medications. That's a lot of smoke for there to be no fire whatsoever. On the other hand, you have the Barnard effect, the tendency for people to see vague descriptions as highly accurate personal assessments. Tell someone they're more intuitive than average, and they'll start noticing all the times their intuition is correct. Tell them they're sensitive to crowded environments, and suddenly every uncomfortable shopping trip becomes evidence of their unique nature. Online communities amplify this. You join a forum full of people who believe Rh-negative blood makes them special. You read hundreds of posts describing traits. You start recognizing those traits in yourself. Or maybe you start interpreting normal experiences through this new lens. Before long, you're convinced you have lower body temperature and heightened empathy, even though you never noticed these things before you learned about Rh blood. This is human psychology. It's not deliberate deception. It's just how our pattern-seeking brains work. But maybe, just maybe, there's something real underneath all the noise. Maybe Rh negatives are genuinely different in subtle ways we don't fully understand yet. Not supernatural, not alien, just human variation that medical science hasn't bothered to study systematically because the differences seem too small to matter. Except they might matter if Rh-negatives process sensory information differently, respond to medications differently, have immune systems calibrated differently. Then understanding these variations could have real clinical applications: better treatment protocols, more personalized medicine, deeper understanding of human genetic diversity. The problem is, we're stuck. Mainstream science won't take the claims seriously because they're mixed up with so much mystical speculation, and Rh-negative communities won't drop the mystical speculation because mainstream science won't take them seriously. It's a standoff. And in the middle are real people with real experiences, trying to figure out whether they're genuinely different or just really good at confirmation bias. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Some of the reported traits are likely real subtle physiological variations that deserve scientific attention. Others are probably psychological, the product of expectation and selective attention, and some might be something else entirely, phenomena we don't have the framework to measure yet because we're asking the wrong questions. But one thing's certain: Rh-negatives believe they're different. Tens of thousands of them. And belief, even without scientific validation, shapes experience. It creates communities. It influences behavior. It becomes its own kind of reality, which raises an uncomfortable question. If there really is something special about Rh-negative blood, something that goes beyond the absence of a single protein, then why isn't anyone seriously studying it? Why has mainstream science ignored or dismissed these claims for decades? Is it simply because the evidence isn't there? Or is there something else going on? Something that brings us to the next part of this story, the part where things stop being just medically curious and start getting genuinely strange. Imagine zooming out even farther than we just did, past the Ice Age landscapes, past the African grasslands, the Neanderthal hunting grounds, the Denisov-Vivan sea routes. Pull the camera out until continents shrink, until Earth is just a blue-white dot hanging in blackness. Now ask a question that makes scientists roll their eyes and conspiracy forums light up Kia Christmas tree. What if Aish negative blood didn't come from here? Because once you start looking at the stranger corners of this mystery, you find a theory lurking in the background of almost every discussion book and late-night radio show about Rh negatives. It goes by a lot of names. Ancient astronaut theory, alien intervention, off-well genetics. But it all boils down to one audacious claim. At some point in our distant past, non-human intelligence interfered with human evolution, and our negative blood is the fingerprint they left behind. Before we decide what to do with that idea, we need to understand where it comes from. Picture the story told by ancient astronaut theorists. It doesn't start in a lab with test tubes and white coats. It starts in the sky. According to this narrative, early humans weren't just watching the stars. They were watching something in the stars, watching back. Beings descending in fiery chariots. Teachers from the heavens bringing agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and law. Gods who weren't really gods at all, but highly advanced extraterrestrials. You see this pattern everywhere once you start looking. In the Sumerian gods who come down from the heavens, in the Egyptian deities with strange hybrid bodies, in the Mesoamerican feathered serpents said to have taught people everything. Ancient astronaut theorists say, these aren't myths. They're heavily mythologized memories of contact with beings from another world. And then they point to Rh negative blood and say, this is the smoking gun. Why? Because Rh negative doesn't play by the usual rules. We've already seen what makes it weird. The missing Rh factor, the immune reaction in pregnancy that treats a nocitive fetus like an invader, the geographical clustering in certain populations. From a mainstream scientific perspective, these are just quirks of genetics and population history. But in the alien hypothesis, they're clues. The logic goes like this. If you were going to alter a species quietly without rewriting everything, you wouldn't redesign the entire genome. You'd introduce something subtle but profound, a variant that can still interbreed with the original population, but isn't quite the same. Something that sometimes triggers biological incompatibility, like a reminder that these two lineages weren't meant to mix easily, a blood type that makes a mother's body wage war against her own unborn child. To some, that doesn't look like random mutation. It looks like a barrier, a firewall, or a marker. Now that idea might sound extreme, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It grew in the shadow of another strange pattern, one that shows up not in ancient bones but in modern bedrooms, cars, and dark rural roads. The UFO abduction narrative. For decades, people around the world have reported eerily similar experiences. Bright lights, paralysis, missing time, strange beings in their room or beside their vehicle. Medical procedures focused obsessively on genetics and reproduction. Most of these stories cannot be verified. Many can be explained by sleep paralysis, psychological factors, cultural contagion. But buried within the noise is a detail that keeps coming up in abduction lore. A surprising number of self-identified abductees claim to have Rh negative blood. Researchers who comb through UFO reports and abduction testimony will tell you they've seen the pattern. Support groups talk about it. Message boards are full of Rh negatives, comparing scars, strange memories, recurring dreams of being examined under harsh lights. Is there a rigorous peer-reviewed study that proves Rh negatives are overrepresented among alleged abductees? No. At least not one that meets standard scientific criteria. Most of the data is anecdotal, self-selected, and vulnerable to confirmation bias. But from inside the UFO community, the correlation looks real enough to be disturbing. And once that seed is planted, they're especially interested in us. It starts to grow its own mythology. Here's how that story usually unfolds. In this framework, extraterrestrials aren't randomly grabbing humans. They're targeting a specific subset, those carrying what some believers call the old blood, the pure line, or simply the negative. To them, Rh negative individuals aren't just different. They're connected. Connected to what? That answer depends on who you ask. Some say Rh negatives carry dormant alien genetics that their visitors are monitoring or trying to reactivate. Others claim the abduction procedures, blood draws, reproductive experiments, embryo removals are part of an ongoing program to either restore a failing alien genome or create a hybrid species that can live on Earth. In this telling, H-negative blood is not random at all. It's the foundation of a controlled breeding program that began in deep prehistory and continues today in hidden craft and underground labs. And if that sounds like science fiction, it's because it is. But it's also something else. A modern myth complete with origin story. That origin story often leads back not to a spaceship, but to a clay tablet, to ancient Sumer. 5,000 years ago, along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, scribes pressed kune for wedges into wet clay. They wrote accounting records, legal codes, hymns, and myths. Among the most famous are about the Anunnaki, powerful beings associated with the heavens. Most mainstream Assyriologists translate Anuni as something like the princely seed or offspring of Anu connected to the sky god. They're divine figures, yes, but still firmly within the mythic framework of the ancient Near East. Then along came Zecharia Sitchin. In the late 20th century, Sitchin proposed a radically different reading. He claimed that the Anunnaki weren't just gods. They were extraterrestrials from a wandering planet he called Nibiru. According to his interpretation, these beings came to Earth to mine gold, needed a labor force, and so genetically engineered early hominins into a worker species, us. In Sitchin's story, the Sumerian tablets don't describe religious allegory. They describe biotechnology, test tubes, gene splicing, hybridization. The creation of humans as we know them was not a spiritual act but a laboratory procedure. Ancient astronaut theorists took this framework and pushed it one step further. If the Anunnaki engineered humans, they argue, they wouldn't have made just one model. They'd have experimented versions, prototypes, variants, some closer to their own biology, some less so. And this, they say, is where right-negative blood fits in. One version of the theory claims our positive humans are the general-purpose worker model optimized for large populations and rapid growth, while Rh-negative lines are either closer to the original Anunnaki template or represent a special priestly or royal subcaste engineered for leadership and control. In this view, the strange reproductive incompatibility between Rh-negative mothers and Rh-positive babies isn't a bug. It's a feature, a way of slowing or controlling the mixing of these two designed populations, a biological reminder that the pure line should remain separate. Tie this to earlier sections, the Nephilim, sons of God mating with humans, royal families obsessed with blood purity, and you can see why the idea is so intoxicating. It promises to connect every loose thread into one grand narrative. Ancient aliens arrived. They engineered humans, they left or went underground. The evidence of their intervention survives in our genomes, in our myths, and in the quiet, stubborn anomaly of Rh-negative blood. But then we have to stop and ask something harsher. Does any of this actually hold up? Look closely at Sitchin's work, and the foundation starts to crack. Professional Sumerian scholars have repeatedly pointed out that his translations aren't just creative. They're often simply wrong. Words, he says, mean rocket ship, mean temple. Phrases he reads as from the planet Nibiru are better translated as crossing place or astral symbolism. The Sumerian tablets do talk about gods descending about creation, about mixing the essence of gods and humans, but in their own cultural context, these are mythic motifs, not lab notes. They function the way Genesis does in the Bible, as a theological explanation of origins, not a technical manual. Then there's the genetics. We don't need extraterrestrials to explain Rh-negative blood. It fits comfortably within what we already know about mutation, recombination, and population dynamics. The Rh system is complex, with multiple genes and variants. The negative form is simply one of those variants maintained and shaped by ordinary evolutionary forces, genetic drift, selection, founder effects. The maternal-fetal incompatibility that looks so dramatic from an alien intervention perspective becomes less mysterious when viewed through medicine. Before modern healthcare, Rh-negative mothers who lost pregnancies would often have reduced fitness, which is one reason Rh-negative frequencies remain relatively low in most populations. Where it does reach higher frequencies, like in the Basque region, population history and isolation, can explain much of the pattern and those alleged abductee correlations. Without properly constructed control groups, blinding and statistical rigor, they remain suggestive stories, not evidence. If an online community focused on UFO experiences starts asking, "Who here is Rh negative?" and dozens of hands go up, Hat doesn't tell us how many thousands of Rh negatives out there never report anything at all. But if the alien hypothesis stumbles under scrutiny, why won't it go away? Because it does something our brains are wired to love. It takes scattered anomalies, Rh negative blood, ancient myths of sky gods, royal obsession with lineage, UFO sightings, abduction narratives, and stitches them into a single emotionally charged story. It tells Rh negative people, you're not just different, you're chosen. It tells a disenchanted world, you're not a cosmic accident. You were designed. It tells a species obsessed with its own origins. The answer is out there, and they might come back. Culturally, that's powerful. It shapes how people see themselves, their ancestry, even their bodies. It has inspired books, documentaries, artwork, and whole communities built around the idea of being starseed or not entirely human. From a strict scientific standpoint, the alien hypothesis is built on speculation, mistranslations, and a heavy dose of wishful thinking. From a cultural standpoint, it's something else entirely. A modern creation myth written with spacecraft instead of chariots and gene splicing instead of divine breath. So where does that leave us? On the one hand, no credible genetic evidence demands an extraterrestrial explanation for Rh negative blood. Everything we've seen in the fossil record, in population genetics, in developmental biology, can be explained without leaving Earth. On the other hand, the very existence of this theory tells us something important about the mystery we're exploring. Rh negative blood isn't just a medical category. It's become a mirror. People look into it and see what they most fear or most hope about human origins. Some see fallen angels, some see royal lineages, some see aliens, and others, especially the ones who quietly live their lives with the rare blood type, see something much more personal. A sense that their difference might mean something, even if no one can agree on what. The question is, what happens when that personal sense of difference attracts the attention of groups that trade in secrecy and power? Because whether or not aliens ever touched our DNA, there are definitely humans who have treated Rh negative blood like it carries a secret worth guarding. That's where we go next. Imagine this. You're 15, donating blood for the first time at a school drive. A nurse looks at your chart, pauses just a little too long, and says, Rh negative. That's rare. Then she calls another nurse over to double-check the typing. They whisper, they nod, and then they smile and tell you everything's fine. Most people walk away and never think about it again. But some don't. They start noticing patterns, hospital staff who seem unusually interested in their blood type, health surveys that ask detailed questions about ancestry, region, even grandparents' birthplaces, online communities full of people comparing notes, convinced that someone somewhere is watching Rh negatives a little more closely than everyone else. This is where the story shifts, from biology to sociology, from population genetics to power. Because once you start looking at how human beings have treated special blood throughout history, a darker possibility emerges. What if for some people, Rh negative isn't just a medical curiosity? What if it's a resource? The claims usually start small. People say certain private organizations, spiritual orders, or esoteric schools quietly ask about blood type during initiations. Sometimes it's disguised as a health question. Sometimes it's framed as ancestry research. A few whistleblowers claim that in some closed groups, being Rh negative doesn't just get you in the door, it moves you to the front of the line. You won't find this in official bylaws. You won't find it in the public mission statements. But you will find a pattern of rumors that refuses to die. Conspiracy forums talk about recruitment funnels, targeting Rh negatives, strange scholarship offers, invitations to exclusive leadership retreats, corporate talent programs that seem weirdly obsessed with biometric data. To skeptics, it's all noise. Random coincidences woven into a story after the fact. To believers, it smells like tracking, like a hidden census of rare blood. And at the center of almost every version of this story sits one name like a black hole bending everything around it. The Illuminati. Strip away the memes and the pop culture parody, And the Illuminati legend is simple. A secret network of elites obsessed with power, symbolism, and crucially just bloodlines. Not just money, not just influence, inheritance, descent, who your ancestors were 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, maybe more. In this mythology, the Illuminati aren't just rich families and expensive suits. They're custodians of a project that started long before modern nations existed, a project to preserve and concentrate certain genetic traits inside a narrow slice of the population. So when Rh negative enters the picture, the theory practically writes itself. A small fraction of the human population carries a rare blood antigen profile that behaves differently in pregnancy, shows unusual geographic clustering, and doesn't line up neatly with known evolutionary pathways. Secretive elites already documented as caring about pedigree and lineage. You put those two facts next to each other, and the human brain does what it always does. It builds a bridge. The claim goes like this: Illuminati-type networks don't just track wealth. They track blood. They encourage marriages between particular families. They cultivate lines of descent, the SAM. Iwe breeders cultivate racish horses. And if Rh negative really is a relic of an ancient bottleneck, a hybridization event, or some other anomaly, then of course that blood would be on their radar. Is any of this proven? No. Has the idea completely taken hold of the modern imagination anyway? Absolutely. To understand why, you have to go back to one of the most persistent myths in European history, the Merovingian bloodline. The Merovingians were a real dynasty, kings of the Franks in early medieval Europe. Long hair, battle axes, shifting alliances with the church and rival tribes. But their legend is bigger than their politics. Medieval chroniclers whispered that the Merovingians were different, that their royal authority came from a special lineage, possibly descending from something more than just ordinary warriors. Fast forward more than 1,000 years. Researchers and authors begin connecting dots that, strictly speaking, don't have to be connected. They take the old Merovingian legends. They add in medieval heresies. They stir in secret societies. Then they ask a question guaranteed to ignite the human imagination. What if some of these families never really disappeared? From this stew came one of the most influential conspiracy texts of the 20th century, Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Its central claim wasn't about a cup, it was about a womb. The authors proposed that the Holy Grail wasn't an object at all. It was a bloodline, specifically a hidden descent line from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, allegedly preserved through the Merovingian dynasty and by extension through certain European noble families still present today. Now park the question of whether that's historically plausible. What matters for our story is how this idea spread. Because once the Grail becomes a bloodline, royal genealogies stop being dusty, old charts and start looking like maps to a living relic. If sacred blood is real, and if it flows through certain modern lineages, then suddenly elite interest in genetics, marriage alliances, and pedigree takes on a new, almost religious dimension. And somewhere in that maze of speculation, Rh negative blood finds its niche. People start asking if there really is a preserved sacred bloodline. Would it show up somewhere? Would it leave a biological fingerprint, a rare trait, a distribution pattern that doesn't match random chance? When you superimpose Rh negative maps over areas linked in legend to the Merovingians, the Knights Templar, and later occult orders, some people don't see coincidence, they see design. The Knights Templar are a perfect example of how this narrative works. Historically, the Templars were a military order founded in the early 12th century to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They became rich, they became powerful, they developed an international banking network centuries before modern finance. Then, just as abruptly, they were crushed, accused of heresy, tortured, executed, disbanded, at least officially. In conspiracy law, the Templars never really died. They went underground, fragmenting into secret branches. Some supposedly became Freemasons. Others became shadowy guardians of hidden relics and dangerous knowledge, including, according to some theories, the truth about a sacred bloodline. If you accept the Grail as bloodline idea, then the Templars' mission changes shape. They're no longer just protecting pilgrims and holy sites. They're protecting DNA. They're bodyguards of a lineage that must not be diluted or destroyed. Here's where Rh negative steps back onto the stage. If some surviving Templar-inspired orders believe they were protecting or cultivating a special bloodline, It wouldn't be crazy within that worldview to quietly gather data on unusual blood traits among potential recruits. To them, a negative raise factor might not just be a medical note. It might be a marker not of superiority, but of continuity, a clue that a faint genetic thread stretching back through the Merovingians, through early heretical sects, through whatever secret they think they're guarding, is still intact. Again, hard evidence for this is limited, but the rumor landscape is crowded. Stories of esoteric groups asking for birth times, maternal surnames, regional origins, then almost as an afterthought, blood type. Applicates who get a warm, almost inexplicable welcome once they mention their Rh-negative patterns that might be pure chance or something else. The deeper question is why this narrative is so compelling even to people who know it might not be true. Part of it is psychological. In a world where most of us feel like interchangeable units inside gigantic systems, the idea of carrying rare blood whispers something radical. You are not generic. You are part of a story older than nations, older than modern religion, maybe older than recorded history itself. It answers two core human needs in one stroke: the need for identity, who am I really, and the need for significance. Does my existence matter in some larger pattern? A story that says your blood is being quietly tracked by elites, whether benevolent or malevolent, does something powerful. It makes you consequential. It also offers a narrative of resistance. If you believe that anonymous institutions are studying, categorizing, and exploiting human genetics, then knowing or suspecting that you're on their list turns you from spectator into participant, either as a target or as a key. And there's something else. Stories about hidden bloodlines, secret societies, and forbidden knowledge also provide a way to talk about very real structures of power that are otherwise hard to see. We know that wealth and influence cluster in certain families. We know that elite education systems and social networks reproduce themselves across generations. Calling these things bloodlines and orders is dramatic, yes, but it's also a symbolic way of describing continuity of power in a world that pretends to be purely meritocratic. The Rh-negative mythos plugs directly into that tension. It suggests that behind the public narratives of democracy and equality, there is another map being drawn and updated, one that cares less about resumes and more about ancestry. Of course, the question remains, is there any real precedent for organizations being interested in genetic lineages? The answer to that is uncomfortably clear. Yes, not in the exact way conspiracy theorists describe, but close enough to make the stories feel less far-fetched. Religious groups of long-tracked priestly or holy lineages, from Jewish Kohanim tracing descent from Aaron to certain Hindu castes preserving ritual authority through patrilineal lines, aristocracies maintained elaborate genealogies, not just for inheritance of land, but for the right to rule itself. In the 19th and 20th centuries, governments and scientific institutions launched massive projects in eugenics and racial hygiene, obsessively documenting ancestry, bloodlines, and eventually genetic markers. Nazi Germany is the most infamous example, but not the only one. Even now, you can see softer versions. Genetic genealogy companies building huge databases of familial connections, medical research programs recruiting specific regional or ethnic cohorts because they carry rare variants of interest. Certain religious communities requiring documented lineage for particular roles. None of this proves that anyone is secretly hunting for Rh-negative blood, but it does prove that when humans gain the ability to track lineage and genetics, someone somewhere always decides to use it. So when people look at the strange history of sacred blood, the modern obsession with genetics, the rumors about secret orders and elite families, and then discover that their own blood type is rare, anomalous, and poorly understood, their minds snap the puzzle pieces together. Maybe the truth is mundane. Maybe Rh-negative is just another quirk of human biology, no more mystical than eye color. Or maybe the real story, the one about who tracks it, who values it, and why, hasn't fully surfaced yet. Either way, the fascination isn't going away. If anything, as genetic technology expands and data becomes the new currency of power, the legend of the rare blood will only grow sharper, and the institutions that know exactly how every drop flows through the modern world, they're not talking. Start with this. In an age where we can edit genes with CRISPR, resurrect ancient DNA from skeletons buried for tens of thousands of years, and map the entire human genome down to individual base pairs. We still do not have a clear, agreed-upon origin story for Rh-negative blood, not a mythic story, not a conspiracy blog story, a scientifically clean, evidence-backed, this is how it happened, narrative. You'd think we would. Rh factor is not obscure. It matters in pregnancy, in transfusions, in basic immunology. Every hospital on Earth types Rh. Every blood bank tracks it. Every prenatal clinic screens for it. This isn't fringe biology. This is routine medicine. And yet, when you go looking for detailed answers about where Rh negativity came from, you hit silence. Not the silence of a cover-up necessarily, more like the silence of a room no one ever really walked into. Why? Part of the answer is brutally simple. Science follows money. Money follows priorities. And Rh negative, for the most part, isn't killing people anymore. Once Rome was developed in the 1960s, the biggest medical problem associated with regio-NT, hemolytic disease of the newborn essentially became preventable in developed countries. Before that, regio-incompatibility could be a death sentence for second or third pregnancies. Now it's a protocol. A shot at 28 weeks, another after birth if needed, and the problem mostly disappears. From a funding perspective, that changes everything. To get big grants, you usually need at least one of three things: a major disease, a profitable therapy, or a breakthrough technology. Rh-negative origin gives you none of those. It's not a disease. There's no expensive drug to develop, and it doesn't demand some sparkling new lab technique to study. At best, it's a curiosity. At worst, it's a dead-end career path. So what you get instead of a flood of papers and competing theories is a trickle. A handful of population studies, some forensic genetics, a couple of evolutionary analyses. Enough to keep the charts up to date, not enough to answer the big questions. And that's where the mystery creeps back in. Because even in that trickle, there are things that don't sit cleanly, things everyone kind of acknowledges, and then quietly moves past. Ask a geneticist what we do know, and the answer sounds reassuring at first, reassuring primarily by the RHD gene on chromosome. Most Rh-positive people have a working copy of that gene that produces the D antigen, the little protein that sticks out on the surface of red blood cells and tells the immune system. I'm Rh-positive. Most Rh-negative people, on the other hand, have either a deletion of the RHD gene or a heavily disrupted version of it. The machinery to make that DANTA gene is missing or broken. No D antigen, no Rh-positive signal. The immune system trained on an IO-negative body sees Rh-positive blood as foreign and sometimes attacks it. On paper, that's straightforward. A missing gene, a recessive trait, standard Mendelian inheritance. But then the questions begin. How old is this deletion? Where did it first appear? Why is it clustered so strongly in a few regions? Basque Country, parts of Western Europe, some North African and Middle Eastern pockets, while staying low elsewhere. Why do certain high-altitude and isolated populations have slightly strange Rh patterns that don't line up neatly with simple drift? This is where one of the few big studies steps in. In 2015, a team of researchers dug into the RHD gene using population genetics and molecular clock techniques, the same tools used to date the split between humans and Neanderthals or to trace the origin of lactose tolerance. Their conclusion was bold, but not widely discussed outside specialist circles. The data fit best with a single ancestral mutation. Not dozens of independent deletions popping up randomly all over the world, but one key event, the original loss or disruption of the RHD gene that created what we now call Rh-negative, one spark. And their model suggested it happened roughly 25,000 to 40,000 years ago, not 800,000 years ago, with the bottleneck, not at the dawn of Homo sapiens as a species, smack in the middle of a period when modern humans were leaving Africa, meeting Neanderthals and Denisovans, painting caves, customizing tools, and spreading across Europe and Asia. A time of contact, hybridization, and intense selection. If that study is right, and not everyone agrees on the exact timing, but the basic picture holds, then Rh-negative is a very recent player in human evolution. It is not some ancient separate lineage. It's not a pre-human blood type. It's a mutation that arose inside already modern humans, relatively late in the game. That doesn't make it less interesting. It actually makes it stranger, Because if one copy of that deletion appeared in one person somewhere between 25,000 and day 40,000 years ago, you have to explain how it didn't just vanish. Most new mutations die with the individuals who carry them. To survive, they either need a massive stroke of luck or a real advantage. So, what kept Rho negative alive? The standard answer is genetic drift and founder effects. Small groups splitting off, carrying quirky traits with them, amplifying them by chance. A band of early Europeans, with a couple of rarely Europeans, with a couple of Rs negative ancestors, settles in an isolated valley. They mostly marry within the group. A few centuries later, the frequency is high enough that frequency is high enough that Rho-laid negative becomes a stable part of the local gene pool. Neat, clean, mathematically elegant. But even among geneticists, that's not the whole story. Some papers hint at possible balancing selection, subtle advantages that might counteract the obvious reproductive risk of incompatibility. There are whispers of associations with resistance to certain infections or differences in oxygen handling or even behavioral tendencies, but nothing strong enough or consistent enough to pass from speculation to established fact. We're back to that uncomfortable territory. Enough pattern to raise questions, not enough data to answer them. And this is where the culture of modern science comes into play. There are questions you can ask safely. What is the ally frequency of RHD deletion in this region? Perfectly acceptable. Can we refine the mutation age estimate with newer genomic data? Go right ahead. Then there are questions that make people shift in their seats. Why do certain European populations have unusually high Rh negative frequencies, compared to others? That's still okay if you keep it dry and statistical. But if you tie that to ancient migrations, to possible archaic admixture scenarios, to ideas of distinct bloodlines, you brush right up against a dark history, scientific racism, eugenics, blood purity myths, Nazi obsessions with Aryan traits. Suddenly, what might be a perfectly legitimate evolutionary question starts to look socially radioactive. So researchers self-censor, not because someone from a secret cabal walks into the lab and says, "Don't go there," but because careers are fragile, reputations matter, and no one wants their work weaponized by extremists or conspiracy theorists. Certain directions, especially those that mix genetics, ancestry, and perceived difference, become unofficially taboo. You can study them, but you move cautiously. You sanitize your language, you avoid big dramatic claims, and sometimes you just pick an easier project. Layer that onto the funding problem, and the result looks from the outside like intentional silence. From the inside, it's more like a quiet steering away from sensitive terrain. So, is there a conspiracy to hide the origins of Rh-negative blood? Not in any organized cinematic sense. There is no official memo from the scientific establishment saying, "Do not investigate Rh-negative ancestry." What there is a system with built-in blind spots. A system that rewards safe, incremental research over weird, high-risk questions. A system that has been burned before by people misusing genetics to justify supremacy myths and doesn't want to touch anything that even smells like that again. And a system that frankly has bigger, more urgent problems on its plate. Pandemics, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, climate-driven epidemics. Rh-negative sits just outside that circle of urgency. Important clinically, yes, but evolutionarily it's treated like a footnote. Meanwhile, the gaps remain. We don't fully understand why Rh-negative persisted despite being a potential reproductive liability in pre-modern times. We don't know whether it conferred subtle survival advantages in specific environments, cold climates, high altitudes, pathogenic zones there. He might have made it more common in some regions than others. We don't know whether there were brief windows in our prehistory where our Rh-negative carriers actually had better outcomes in certain contexts. Hard winters, famine, childbirth complications, only for those advantages to fade as societies changed. And because we don't know, other stories rush in to fill the vacuum. Stories of alien bloodlines, angelic visitations, ancient hybrids, stories that say, if science won't give us an origin, we'll write our own. But there's another possibility, less dramatic, but no less fascinating, the possibility that Rh-negative is simply a piece of unsolved science. A recent mutation that rose to noticeable frequency through a messy mix of drift, chance, and maybe some tiny context-dependent advantages we haven't detected yet. A mutation that just happened to arise in populations whose later history, bases, royal families, fringe communities made it look more mysterious than it really is. Science, when it's honest, is full of these half-finished puzzles. Dark matter, consciousness, the exact sequence of events that led to language. We have models, hints, fragments, not final answers. Rh-negative belongs to that category. Not outside science, not beyond science, just not solved yet. And that's where the real tension lies. If the Rh-negative enigma is eventually cracked with a dull explanation, a single mutation, probably neutral, amplified by founder effects and historical marriage patterns, a lot of mythology collapses overnight. If, on the other hand, deeper research does uncover strange correlations, subtle cognitive differences, survival advantages in specific ancient ecologies, links to archaic admixture no one expected, then the story gets even stranger, and the line between myth and reality begins to blur in dangerous ways. For now, modern science stands in the middle. Knowing enough to say, this isn't obviously supernatural, but not enough to say, this is exactly how it happened. So, the questions hang in the air, just out of reach. Where did that first Rh-negative individual live? A woman in Ice Age Europe, a man on the fringe of a Near Eastern hunting band, a child born into a group that would one day feed into the Basque pool. Did anyone notice they were different? Did it matter? And if modern science is unwilling or unable to chase those questions to the end, someone else will. Which brings us to the people living with this blood type today. The ones who feel different, who see patterns in their lives and bodies the textbooks don't explain. The ones who aren't satisfied with it's just a mutation. Their voices are rarely heard in academic papers, but they're loud and growing everywhere else. In the next section, we're going to listen to them. Now, zoom in. Forget ancient chromosomes, forgotten empires, secret lodges. Picture a single person sitting in a fluorescent-lit waiting room, paper bracelet on their wrist, staring at a lab report they don't understand. Blood type O-negative. Rh-negative. For millions of people, that's where the story really starts. Not with myths, not with Nephilim or royal bloodlines, with a nurse frowning at a chart and saying, you don't see that every day. Listen long enough to Rh-negative people, and you start hearing the same kinds of stories, different countries, different cultures, same strange echoes. It doesn't prove anything by itself, but it's a pattern. And patterns are where mysteries begin. Let's start with the most documented, the most painful, the one that dragged Rh-negative blood into the medical spotlight. Pregnancy. Ask any Rh-negative mother, and you'll hear the language of risk. One woman from the UK describes her first pregnancy like this. I thought it would be normal. Then they told me my blood was trying to kill my baby. That's the word the midwife used, kill. I went from being excited to being terrified in about 30 seconds. Her story is not unusual. Rikiers, negative mother. Read, positive father. Read, positive fetus. The mother's immune system sees the baby's blood cells as foreign. Like an infection, it builds antibodies, a microscopic army that in an unprotected second pregnancy can cross the placenta and start destroying the baby's red blood cells. Hemolytic disease of the newborn, jaundice, anemia, brain damage, stillbirth. Before modern medicine, this was a quiet tragedy that nobody understood. Women who had one healthy child and then mysteriously lost everyone after, in some villages, they were blamed, cursed, punished. In others, the pattern was just accepted as bad luck. Today, there's the shot. Rogum antidimunog globulin, a carefully engineered medical truce between mother and child. It works incredibly well, but that doesn't erase the emotional impact of hearing. Without this, your body might attack your baby. Online on Rh-negative forums and private groups, you see the same phrases over and over. I felt like my body betrayed me. I was terrified every ultrasound. I didn't tell my family how serious it was. I didn't want them to panic. Then there are the ones who didn't get the shot in time. Older women pregnant before the protocol was routine in their country. They write about miscarriages with a kind of stunned, quiet rage. No one explained it to me back then. They said it was nature. Now I find out my blood type was probably the reason. I carried that guilt for 30 years. Medically, the mechanism is cold, clear immunology. Psychologically, it can feel like a curse. And when you've already been told your blood type is rare, unusual, different, that story lands hard. But pregnancy is only one chapter. Scroll through Ride Negative communities and you see other themes. Not as clean, not as easy to map onto immune reactions and blood cells, but persistent, insistent, like background noise you can't quite tune out. Headaches, sensitivities, a feeling of being wired differently. One man from Brazil writes, "I don't know if it's the blood or not, but my whole life I've been hypersensitive to noise and light. I walk into a crowded room and feel like I'm being attacked from all directions. I didn't even know I was Rye negative until my 2 zeros, but when I found the groups online, it was like scrolling through my own brain. Others talk about lower body temperature, faster healing, or the opposite, chronic fatigue, or autoimmune issues, strange allergic reactions. None of this by itself screams Rye negative. These are common human problems, but the people experiencing them are looking for patterns. And once you find a label, everything starts orbiting around it. Then there's the weirder stuff. I've always had vivid, almost prophetic dreams. I can walk into a room and feel when something bad happened there. Animals trust me instantly. Even aggressive dogs calm down when I'm near. Is that biology, psychology, confirmation bias, or something we don't have a word for yet? Hard to say, but the stories are there, thousands of them. People connecting dots between their blood type and what they perceive as heightened intuition, emotional sensitivity, or spiritual experience. And then there's the most common theme of all. I've never really felt like I belong here. This one shows up everywhere. Reddit threads, niche forums, private Facebook groups, with membership questions like, "Are you Rh negative?" followed by, "Do you often feel like an outsider?" A woman from the United States writes, "In school, I always felt off. Like everyone else, got a rule book I hadn't been given. I could mimic what people did, but it never felt natural. When I found out I was Rh negative, it didn't explain it logically, but it gave it a container, a seeker. Oh, that's why I'm different. Even if that's not scientifically true, it changed how I saw myself." Psychologists call this identity construction. Take a trait you can't control, height, eye color, blood type, and wrap meaning around it. That meaning can be empowering or isolating depending on the story you plug into. And the internet is full of stories. Some Rh negative communities lean heavily into science. They share studies on hemolytic disease, transfusion protocols, population genetics. They're skeptics, trying to peel away the myths and understand what, if anything, is actually unique about their blood. Others dive headfirst into esoterica. You see thread titles like, "Rh negative starseeds, share your paranormal experiences. Share your paranormal experiences. Rh negative only." Do you remember things from before you were born? People swap UFO sightings, near-death experiences, strange synchronicities. Some talk about feeling watched their whole lives, of having missing time episodes, of seeing shadow figures in the corners of their vision. Is any of that probably linked to Rh negative status? No. There's no robust evidence that Rh negative individuals are more psychic, more abducted, more haunted than anyone else. But when you gather thousands of people who already feel unusual, already feel like statistical outliers, you create a perfect incubator for these kinds of narratives. And that's where the tension lies. On one side, you have lived experience. The mother whose first child almost died because her blood attacked it. The man who spent decades feeling like an alien until a blood test finally gave him a word for his difference. The teenager who discovers being O negative makes them a universal donor and suddenly feels both special and strangely expendable. On the other side, you have science looking at Reg-A, blood, and saying essentially it's a missing surface protein. It matters for pregnancy and transfusions. Beyond that, it's just variation. For some people, that's comforting, normalizing. I'm not an alien. I'm just a little weird immunologically. For others, it feels like erasure, a flattening of a story that to them is rich, charged, and deeply personal. One Rh negative nurse from Canada describes the moment she learned her own type. "I was in training. We were practicing typing blood. Mine came back a negative. My instructor said, 'One of the odd ones.' Everyone laughed. It was a joke, but it stuck with me. One of the odd ones." Later, when I saw how carefully we had to match Rye for transfusions, when I sat with women getting Roy AM injections, I thought maybe we are odd, not magical, not special, just more fragile in certain ways, more complicated. Others talk about the psychological whiplash of going from "I'm just me" to "I'm part of this tiny percentage of people with a trait nobody can fully explain historically." Some lean into it, adopting the Rh-negative identity like a badge. They change their usernames, join specialized groups, read everything they can find about royal bloodlines, Nephilim aliens. They feel suddenly plugged into a cosmic narrative. Their headaches, their anxiety, their social awkwardness all become clues pointing to some grand hidden truth. Others recoil. They don't want to be special. They don't want to be fodder for conspiracy theories or recruitment targets for fringe cults, promising activation of Rh-negative powers. For them, the knowledge becomes a quiet burden, something to mention only to doctors and maybe partners considering children. And then there are the people who sit in the middle. They know the science, they know the limitations. They can quote the studies showing no significant personality differences between Rh-positive and Rh-negative populations. But when they step back and take in their own lives, the strange health issues, the constant sense of standing half a step outside of normal human experience, they can't quite shake the feeling that there's more to the story. One Rh-negative man from Eastern Europe puts it this way: "I don't believe I'm descended from aliens. I don't believe I'm psychic. But when I'm in a room full of people and I feel like I'm watching them from behind glass, when I get that sense of distance, and then I log into a forum and see 100 Rh-negatives describing the same thing in almost the same words, I have to ask, is it just coincidence, or is there some subtle neurological hormonal developmental effect that we haven't measured yet?" That question hangs over every testimonial, every late-night post in every Rh-negative group. Where does biology end and story begin? How much of feeling different is wiring? How much is being told you're different? And how much is the human tendency to weave meaning into any crack big enough to hold it? What we can say with some confidence is this: Rh-negative blood changes how your body responds to pregnancy and transfusions. That alone is enough to alter a life, to lose a child, to save a stranger on an operating table, to live with a hidden little time bomb in your veins that only matters when certain conditions are met. On top of that, Rh-negative people are humans like everyone else, story-driven, pattern-seeking, hungry for identity. When medicine tells them you're statistically rare, and history whispers your type clusters in strange places, and folklore hints your blood was once reserved for kings and gods, those stories don't just bounce off, they sink in, they shape perception, they color memory. So when Rh-negatives talk about feeling like outsiders, like watchers, like survivors of something no one else remembers, we can't just wave it away as delusion. But we also can't honestly point to a gene and say, there it is, the outsider switch, the alien marker. We're left in the in-between space. The same place we've been with this entire enigma. A rare blood factor, a history full of gaps, a chorus of voices saying something about this feels different. Even as the data so far shrugs its shoulders in that gap between lab reports and lived experience, myths grow, conspiracies multiply, people find me. Aining, comfort, and sometimes danger. And if the scientific record won't close the distance, something else will step in to fill it. In the final section, we're going to stand in that space and ask a simple, uncomfortable question. After all the legends, all the testimonies, all the speculation, what, if anything, can we actually conclude about the Rh-negative enigma? So, after all of this, where does that leave you? If you're Rh-negative, are you the descendant of an ancient bloodline guarded by kings and secret societies? A statistical fluke of human evolution? A leftover echo of some older, stranger branch of humanity? Let's strip this down to the bones. What do we actually know? And where does the story shift from evidence, as to interpretation, to pure speculation? First, the hard part, the facts. Rh-negative is real. It's not an internet myth or a new age invention. It's a well-documented blood phenotype caused by specific genetic variants on chromosome 1 that result in the absence of the Rhd protein on red blood cells. About 15% of Europeans are Rh-negative. In some populations, like the Basque, that number climbs over 30%. In others, especially in parts of East Asia and Africa, it drops below 5%. We know Rh-negative can cause very real medical complications. An Rh-negative mother carrying an Rh-positive fetus can develop antibodies that attack the baby's red blood cells. Before modern medicine, this could be fatal. Today, with Rogam and prenatal care, it's more of a managed risk than a death sentence. But it's a reminder. This trait isn't obviously superior. Evolution tolerates it, it doesn't worship it. We also know this. Genetics doesn't show a clean alien gene or a clearly non-human insertion. The Rh system fits inside the normal architecture of human variation. The genes involved, like RhD and RhCe, look like typical mammalian genes that have been duplicated, TED, and modified over millions of years. You can trace their relatives in other primates. There is no fluorescent, this came from space tag in the code. So, on the whiteboard under documented fact, you can write RAD negative is a real genetically defined blood type. It's unevenly distributed among human populations. It creates specific pregnancy risks. Its genetic basis fits comfortably inside known human biology. That's the boring part. The part that doesn't get TikTok views. The part that doesn't sound like Nephilim or star seeds or reptilian royal families. But then there's everything that doesn't fit so neatly. The parts that keep the mystery alive. Why is Rh negative so clustered in certain groups, like the Basque, some Celtic populations, and a few isolated communities? Why does it seem to cling to certain lineages, like European royal houses, far beyond what you'd expect from random inheritance? Why do so many Rh negative people independently report the same clusters of experiences? Heightened sensitivity, vivid dreams, feelings of being different, intense reactions to certain environments or people. Science has some answers, not all of them. Not yet. Population genetics can explain geographic clustering. You take a small founding group with a high Rh negative frequency, you isolated them with language, geography, or culture, and the trait can snowball. This is called genetic drift. It's not mystical, it's math. Royal bloodlines hoarding specific traits. That's not supernatural either. That's what happens when elites practice close intermarriage for centuries. They don't just keep land and titles in the family, they keep genes. As for the personal experiences, heightened empathy, strange coincidences, a sense of being out of step with the world, science can say these are subjective reports. It can look for patterns with surveys, brain scans, physiological studies. But it can't crawl inside your dreams. It can't measure the way the hair on your arm stands up when you walk into a place that feels wrong for reasons you can't explain. And this is where the gap opens between what can be proven and what can only be felt. On one side of that gap, you have the grounded skeptics. They'll tell you Rh negative is just a recessive trait. The Basque thing is founder effect. The royal obsession is cultural symbolism. Everything else is confirmation bias and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. On the other side, you have the experiences, the mystics, the conspiracy researchers. They'll say the clustering isn't random. The myths of gods mating with humans, the idea of chosen blood, the recurring themes of blue-eyed, pale-skinned, or other people in folklore. These are distorted memories of something real, something different that walked among early humans and left descendants who still carry that difference today. Both sides can point to data. The skeptics point to genetic sequencing studies. No extra chromosomes, no non-human markers, no obvious engineered alterations. The immune reactions of regressations of Rh negative mothers to Rh positive fetuses look like a standard immune response to foreign antigens, not evidence of two incompatible species. The believers point to mythological consistency. Stories of sky beings, watchers, Nephilim, shining ones, fair folk serpent kings, different continents, different eras, same motifs. They point to the stubborn survival of the sacred bloodlines in ruling classes across empires and eras. They point to the fact that amid millions of traits, this particular one status just happens to be one that literally draws a hard line between like me and not like me at the level of blood. So what can you actually conclude? You can conclude that Rh negative is a genuine biological variation with real-world consequences. You can conclude that its uneven distribution and social history make it a perfect canvas for myth-making. You can conclude that so far no reputable scientific study has found evidence that Rh negative people are a separate species, hybrid, or engineered population. You can also conclude something else, something less comfortable for both hard skeptics and true believers. We don't fully understand why Rh negative emerged, spread, and persisted the way it did. We can build models. We can say maybe it hitchhiked along with some other advantage, better resistance to specific diseases, compatibility with certain diets, or some unknown physiological edge in prehistoric environments. We can say maybe it's just one of countless quirks that slipped through the evolutionary sieve because it wasn't harmful enough to be eliminated. But we don't know, not with the kind of certainty that closes the book. And here's where the deeper question surfaces. Why does this bother us so much? Humans are obsessed with origins. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we ordinary? Or are we ordinary? Or are we special? The genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago turned a scattered primate species into a forged lineage of survivors. Every human alive today is the descendant of people who clung to life in a world that was trying to erase them. That story alone is extraordinary. You don't need aliens, angels, or secret reptilian overlords to make humanity special, but we still reach for more because you are the product of a long chain of random survival events. Doesn't satisfy the parts of us that crave meaning. We want to hear you were chosen. You are marked. Your blood is proof that you belong to something bigger, older, more powerful. RH negative taps into that desire like a key sliding into a lock. It gives people a way to say, my difference isn't just random. It means something. The danger comes when that need for meaning overrides critical thinking, when every coincidence becomes a sign, when every pattern becomes a plot, when curiosity about bloodlines turns into purity myths and hierarchies. So how do you walk the line? How do you stay open to possibility without falling into fantasy? You start by holding two ideas in your mind at the same time. 1. The evidence we currently have does not support the claim that HIV-negative people are a distinct non-human or superhuman group. 2. The evidence we currently have does not fully explain the origin, distribution, or historical fixation on Ricard blood. In that narrow space between those two statements, real inquiry lives. You can ask, did HIV-negative hitchhike with some ancient adaptation we haven't identified yet? Are there subtle physiological or neurological differences linked to RH status that haven't been rigorously studied because they're not medically obvious? Could cultural practices like treating certain lineages as special for social or religious reasons have amplified RH-negative in particular families or regions over thousands of years? You can also ask harder questions. Why are we so quick to divide ourselves into us, and them even at the level of blood? Why do we keep resurrecting the old idea that some humans are closer to gods or aliens than others? What does believing you're part of a chosen bloodline give you psychologically that ordinary humanity does not? None of these questions require angels or aliens to matter. They require courage to look at your desire to be special, to examine the myths you've inherited, to test them against evidence and still respect the mystery when the evidence runs out. And maybe that's the real power of the RH-negative enigma. Not that it proves anything supernatural, but that it forces you to confront how you think. Are you willing to change your mind if better data appear? Res, are you willing to admit we don't know, instead of grabbing the nearest comforting story? Are you willing to explore the weird edges of human experience without surrendering your ability to question? Because some mysteries will be solved. Genomic technology will get sharper. We'll map ancient DNA from more skeletons. We might one day trace exactly when the chasm of mutations arose in which ancestral population, under what environmental pressures, but some mysteries won't. We will probably never know what it felt like to be the first rage-negative mother watching her positive baby die and wondering if the gods cursed her blood. We will never fully reconstruct the webs of meaning ancient elites spun around their own lineages. We will never catalogue every whispered story told in isolated villages about those people with strange blood. And that's okay. Mystery isn't a failure. It's an invitation. If you're Rh-negative, you carry a trait that has been feared, prized, ritualized, and pathized. A trait that modern science can describe, but not fully explain in its cultural and psychological impact. If you're Rh-positive, you carry the other half of the story, the majority phenotype that made your existence possible when medicine turned deadly incompatibility into manageable risk. Both of you carry the deeper mark, the fused chromosome that ties you back to the survivors of the great bottleneck. The language circuits, refined in tiny scattered bands, trying not to vanish. The urge to tell stories about where you come from and why that matters. So maybe the real question isn't, is Rh negative proof of aliens, Nephilim, or secret gods? Maybe the real question is, what does it say about us? That when we find a strange pattern in our blood, our first instinct is to write a myth. And a second question, if we're already the descendants of the toughest survivors this planet has ever pry. Oh, deuced, how much more special do we really need to be? So, where does that leave you? You've just walked through a maze that started in a hospital lab with a routine blood test and ended in ancient caves, royal courts, secret lodges, and maybe even star systems that don't have names yet. We've gone from antigens and elves to Nephilim and nobles, from pregnancy complications to papal bloodlines, from peer-reviewed journals to whispers in forgotten archives. And after all of that, the core mystery is still staring back at you. On one level, Rh negative is simple: a missing protein on the surface of red blood cells, a quirk of immunology, a genetic variant that probably emerged in one small isolated population tens of thousands of years ago, and then spread, mixed, and diffused through the chaos of human history. But that's never been the whole story, has it? Because wrapped around that missing protein is something else. Patterns nobody fully explains, clusters in strange places, myths that echo the same themes across cultures that supposedly never met, stories of different blood, pure blood, sacred blood passed down like a code, half remembered and half invented. Science can map the DNA. It can trace the alleles, estimate the mutation age, build neat little family trees out of statistical models. What it can't do is answer the question that really bothers people. Why does this feel like more than just a missing protein? That's where the myths rush in. Fallen angels, star visitors, hidden lineages, guarded by kings and secret orders, claims of heightened perception, strange sensitivities, out-of-place experiences. Some of it is clearly fantasy, some of it is clearly fraud, but some of it sits in that uncomfortable gray area where personal experience and measurable data don't quite line up. And humans hate gray areas. Our brains are not built to accept loose ends. We survived an ancient climate bottleneck by turning chaos into narratives, by seeing patterns, inferring causes, building stories that linked past and future. That survival trick is still running in your skull right now. You hear rare blood type unusual reactions in pregnancy, strange geographic clusters, and your mind does exactly what your ancestors' minds did when they watched the sky darken or the herds vanish. It starts asking, who did this, why? What does it mean? That's why Rh negative becomes such a perfect canvas. It sits at the intersection of everything we can measure and everything we still don't understand about ourselves. Biology on one side, myth on the other, and in the middle, you trying to decide which parts feel true. Maybe you're Rh negative yourself. Maybe you've had doctors look twice at your chart. Maybe your mother told you stories about a dangerous pregnancy, or a transfusion that went wrong, or the way your family keeps certain things in the bloodline. Maybe you felt different and went searching for a reason, and someone somewhere told you. It's because your blood isn't like everyone else's. Whether that's scientifically meaningful or not, emotionally it lands. It sticks. It shapes identity. And that more than any lab result is where this enigma really lives. Because the deeper question behind all of this isn't just what is Rh negative, it's what are we? Are we the descendants of a single small group of survivors who crawled out of a climate catastrophe and slowly, painfully built language, art, culture, and cities? Are some of us carrying echoes of older human cousins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, lost branches we barely have names for? Did those crossings, those ancient nights of shared fires and shared fears, leave biochemical fingerprints like Rh variants, altitude genes, immune quirks, or, as some insist, is there something else in the mix? Something non-human, something we can't fit into the comfortable timeline of fossils and stone tools. Right now, nobody can give you a final answer that closes the book. Not the geneticists, not the theologians, not the ufologists, not the conspiracy theorists writing manifestos at 3 o'clock in the morning. And maybe that's the point. The search itself, the need to know where you came from, why your body is the way it is, what your ancestors survived, and what they might have hidden. That need is deeply, brutally human. It's the same drive that pushed our species out of Africa, across ice sheets, over open oceans, into every environment we were never supposed to conquer. Rh negative is just one more thread in that vast tangled story. Tug on it hard enough and it drags you through everything. Evolution, myth, empire, religion, science, and the stories families tell in hushed voices when they think nobody else is listening. So now the question turns back to you. If you're Rh negative, what has that meant in your life? Have you had strange medical experiences, unusual sensitivities, coincidences you can't quite shake? Have you ever been told your blood was special, rare, needed, dangerous? If you're Rh positive, what theories make the most sense to you? Do you see this as a fascinating but ultimately ordinary genetic variation, or do you suspect there's more going on than the official story admits? I want to hear it. Share your experiences, your family stories, your theories, wild or grounded, in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, what your blood type is, if you're comfortable sharing, and which part of this journey hit you the hardest. And if this exploration pulled you in, if it made you think differently about your own veins and the history humming inside them, consider taking a second to like this video. Drop a comment and subscribe. It seems small, but it tells the algorithm that investigations like this are worth surfacing, worth continuing. For those of you who want to go even deeper, who want longer dives into the kinds of mysteries most channels won't touch, you can also join our membership here on YouTube. That support helps fund the research, the late-night archive trolls, the interviews, the data digging. It's completely optional. This content will keep coming either way. But if you choose to become a member, it lets us push further into the shadows where the questions get stranger and the answers get harder to find. Because Rh negative is not the only enigma lurking in our blood and bones. Ahead, we're going to follow the trail into other genetic anomalies, forgotten civilizations that appear too advanced for their age, star maps carved into stone, and archaeological finds that don't sit comfortably in the official timeline. We'll look at other traits that cluster in unsettling ways, other stories of chosen lineages and forbidden knowledge. The bottleneck wasn't the end of our story, it was the beginning of 1,000 branching paths. Some remembered, some erased, some deliberately hidden. This blood mystery is just one of them. The enigma continues. The only real question is whether you're coming with us to see where it leads next.